Hi, welcome to More Christ. This is a channel dedicated to Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox alike. Today I'm joined by Mike Aquilina. Mike is an author and editor of more than 60 books and has co-hosted 11 series that are in EWTN. He's also got his own podcast, Way of the Fathers. He and his wife Terry have 6 children, who are the subject of his book, Love and the Little Things. So just to begin then, Mike, can you please tell us a bit about your background and some of the key currents in your life that have helped to form your character and that have really moved you to write about Christ and his church?
My background, well, I'm a small town boy. I've always lived in small towns, so there's not too much that's urban about me. But I live close to the city of Pittsburgh. I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania. Both of my parents were devout Catholics, and they really did model the virtues for me. Both of them were 47 when I was born, and I think that circumstance in itself had a profound influence on me because it made me feel close to history. Right? Because my parents had me very late in life, and their own memory stretched back so far and was extended by the memories of their own parents. So I had a sense of history from very early on. I was educated in Catholic schools, and I went off to university, and I've worked in publishing now for boy, it's a lot of years, 38 years this year. So yeah, I've always been scribbling.
Yeah, wonderful. And then what sort of first prompted your interest in some of the things that you focus most on? So say theology or poetry and those central concerns.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think my interest in words in general was sparked, and I can remember the moment, which is very strange. It was sparked when I was a young kid. I was in elementary school, and we had a textbook, and it was one of these mass-produced textbooks that were nondescript for the most part, but there was a paragraph in the book that talked about lyrics and in music and how lyrics should work. And I remember it used the sentence that opens the Declaration of Independence, one of the founding documents of the United States. Mm-hmm. When in the course of human events, and it just took that phrase, when in the course of human events, and it analyzed the way the consonants and the vowels rubbed up against each other, mm-hmm. and kind of the resistance that certain consonants gave to other consonants and so on. And I was fascinated by that paragraph, and it awakened in me a sensitivity to the music that's in language, not only the language that's in music, but the music that's there in language. And it made me excited about it. And I started watching for it everywhere and listening for it everywhere. And I think that that's what made me it kind of predisposed me to love poetry and love good song lyrics and love writing in general. As for theology and everything, well, I guess being raised in a Catholic environment, getting a Catholic education, you always had these ideas kind of in the air around you. Yeah. You know, they were always being communicated in some way. In religion class and even outside religion class, they could find their way into biology class, and why shouldn't they? So this came naturally to me. It was a time, you know, the years when I grew up were the 60s and the 70s, and it was a time of great tumult in the church, and that tumult was reflected in our schools, in the curriculum, and in everything else. So while there were these voices from the tradition, there were also kind of other voices that were trying to introduce new ways of thinking into the church. And we heard all of those too. And it was a lot to sort out. And I think the abiding impression for a lot of us who grew up during that time is that Catholicism is crazy. It makes no sense whatsoever. And, you know, these teachers who were trying to impose the latest ideas on us, you know, just seemed to us ridiculous, because your teachers always seem ridiculous. They're only 35 years old, but they seem ancient to you, right? And they think they're young, and they're trying to impose these new ideas on you. And you're saying, ma'am, these ideas are old already. you're an aging hippie. Stop it, So, Catholicism seemed crazy. That was just our impression of it. So a lot of us stopped practicing in our teen years. I think that was pretty common for my graduating class, pretty common for my classmates. I didn't really practice through my college years, and it's just where we were. But still, we had the echoes of the tradition in here, because we had heard the prayers, we had lived the liturgy, we were aware of the saints, and we knew the way history unfolded. We knew something about the medievals. We knew something about the Renaissance just because we knew something about Christianity. It's all part of our makeup. So when it did come time for me to get more serious about life, and you start to wrestle with these ideas and these circumstances and these situations, well, I had all of this to wrestle with, and that was a good place to be.
Yeah, wonderful. And then were there any persons that were especially influential or inspirational for you at that time, or that you can think of that come to mind immediately?
Like so many people in my generation, Thomas Merton was a very articulate voice for the spiritual life and actually for the Catholic tradition. So he had a deep influence on me when I was very young, and he led me to so many others because I could see that he was he was long dead by then, but he was, you're getting into his writings and you can see that he was corresponding with others. This name Jacques Maritain comes into my consciousness, and then I start reading these works of Jacques Maritain, and then his wife Raisa Maritain and her memoirs and all of the people that they encountered. And so they one thing led to another. They were like dominoes, one after another, and I was able to engage so many of the great voices of the generation that had come just before me, so many of the generations, so many of the voices that had really helped to create the world I was living in, especially the Catholic world I grew up in. And I just had never heard of them because they had fallen out of fashion by then. And they, of course, led me to their ultimate sources, who were the ancients.
Yeah, marvelous. And then I guess moving from that perspective you had where you didn't have respect for those authorities and that interest in history with these outdated ideas and hippies and so on, what was it about the likes of Maritain or Merton or people like that, or even the church fathers, that you found interesting and convicting, or whatever you found insightful about them?
I think in every case, it was the ability to stretch me, to take me places where maybe I didn't want to go, but I saw that, well, I guess I have to go to those places if I want to be honest with myself, and they modeled a kind of life too. Maritain in particular modeled a life of friendship, and specifically an intellectual and cultural kind of friendship that was expansive, that was open. I read those memoirs and they described his friendships with some of the great artists of his time, many of whom were not Catholic. Jean Cocteau, I'm thinking of Marc Chagall, so many of the composers who were living in Paris and the writers. He was open to so many ideas and he was willing to engage them, and yet he had a firm sense of himself and he was not threatened because they had different ideas. So he would invite these people into his home and he would engage them in conversation. They could always find lively conversation there. And so many of them came into the Catholic fold. And I felt as if I kind of walked into his salon, and I found my home too there.
Yeah, marvelous. Just taking off from there, then let's look at some of your own work, if we may. So I think that speaks to the theme of your book, How Christianity Saved Civilization and Must Do So Again. So you go into a lot of detail there, mentioning that ancient Rome's brutal culture exploited the weak and that they considered human life expendable, that women were used as property, and even unwanted children were left in the streets to die. Yet only 4 centuries later, even ordinary men and women were prosperous and what became a vigorous new Christian society, one that served the vulnerable, that exalted women, treasured virtue and loved peace, which went on then to flourish for the next 1500 years. So can you describe the basic thesis of that book and what maybe compelled you to write it?
Well, implicit in that book is the idea of human dignity, which is a distinctively Christian idea. And it's so much just a part of our cultural wallpaper now that we've forgotten how distinctively Christian it is. But it's the Judeo-Christian religious culture that introduced this into the world. Very recently, last year, the year before maybe, there was a New York Times bestseller called Dominion. And why am I blanking on the author's name? He's a wonderful historian. Yes, Tom Holland. But it's a wonderful book, and it talks about this idea of human dignity and how it changed everything in our culture. And we've forgotten this, and now in modern times, we've come to throw over Christianity, but try to hold on to our idea of human dignity. But it becomes a brittle thing or a slippery thing at that point, and we can't hold on to it. We find ourselves lapsing into all of these things that would be considered sins according to the Christian view of the world. Now, I'm not saying that Christians have always lived up to the doctrine of human dignity that's quite explicit in the book of Genesis. That we haven't, and there are many instances down through the centuries where Christians have fall short of it. And Tom Holland details those in painful detail. I mean, he puts those out there. But we have the mechanism for self-criticism and reform. We have the standards that are there and are undeniable. So we have to hold ourselves to those standards. And if we fall from them, well, then we have to see it clearly, repent, and bring ourselves back up. That idea is one of many that was introduced into the bloodstream of the world by Christianity, and we've come to rely on it. There are others too. You mentioned human dignity, human rights, human equality, universal human equality, the idea of world peace, the idea of ethics for the battlefield. All of these things were introduced into history by Christians or by Christianity. There are other things, institutions that were introduced by Christianity, the hospital, the university, the hospice, the orphanage. All of these things, and Tom Holland alludes to all of these as well, came about because of Christian ideas about hospitality, about self-sacrifice, self-giving, about charity. And I tend to think that the institutions and the ideas that we hold dear are impossible to sustain apart from their Christian foundations. Their house is built on sand, and apart from the Christian idea of charity, which is rooted in the tripersonal nature of God, you lose everything. Mm-hmm. You lose everything. Suddenly, you start to draw lines about human dignity, for example, and you'll say these humans have dignity, these humans do not. And once you do that, you're kind of withdrawing to a pre-Christian place, because in the ancient world, there were certain ideas about human dignity, but what did we mean by human? We meant people like me, people who look like me, who have my language, who bow to the same emperor as I do, who share my culture, people who are as able as I am, who are as fit as I am, people who can do work that is as productive as mine is. Those people have human dignity. The others do not. Slaves did not have human dignity. They did not share the kind of human dignity that their masters had, and so slaves could be raped with impunity. That was allowed. Slaves could be abused in countless ways, and they could even be killed, and you weren't going to be punished for it. Mm-hmm. Christianity does give so much to what we call civilization that it's hard to imagine civilization apart from its Christian elements at this point, or it should be.
Yeah, marvelous, Mike. And Then I've been thinking about this recently. Your book helped me a lot in this regard. And then there's another Catholic author, William Kavanagh, who talks about the migration of the holy to the government and things like that. So they have appropriated Christian ideas and twisted them and used them for nefarious purposes to serve the government or the market or whatever the case may be. Then you mentioned there, so you mentioned in the book the different 7 revolutions that Christ brought into the world, as you mentioned, the hospital and things like that. But nowadays, as you say, we're seeing a return to that tribalism, and there seems to be a twisting of Christian institutions and different things like that, again, for nefarious purposes, and dividing people according to, say, skin color or whatever the case, class system or whatever the case may be. So I wanted to ask you how the old paganism might be compared and contrasted with the new form, this kind of neo-paganism. What continuities and discontinuities are there? That makes sense?
Yes, yes. What continuities, what discontinuities? Well, I think that we do seem to be witnessing a rebrutalizing of culture, and the sociologist Rodney Stark has talked about this in the same way Tom Holland has. Neither Stark nor Holland identifies as Christian. Okay, you know, they both kind of identify as agnostic, and yet they're alarmed that we seem to be sliding back to this pre-Christian attitude. And Stark brings out the thrill that we seem to get in witnessing violence. You know, that our entertainment grows more and more violent, even as we, you know, will say we're personally opposed to violence. You know, we don't want to go there, but we sure like to watch it, and we sure like to indulge it on the screen. In the same way, you know, we will reject the objectification of women, and yet increasingly we objectify women through entertainment, through advertising, through marketing, through billboards. So there are so many ways, it seems, that we are reverting to that time, and to the emphasis on the misuse, the abuse of women by overly sexualizing them and reducing them to objects that way. So I mean, there are so many ways that that our culture is like this. You know, when I just had this memory of a time when I was touring Greece, and I believe it was in Corinth. I was visiting the site of this temple, and right there was an indoor museum attached to the place, and it was showing various votive offerings. And you know, if you look at the museum or at the temple itself, in its remains, in its ruins, it looks so chaste. It looks so beautiful in its classical simplicity of its lines, of its columns, and there's something stunning about all that. When you go inside the museum, I remember this, the curator of the museum opened a drawer for us, and it was a shallow drawer, so you could see all of the votive offerings that were found there. And they were almost all pornographic in their depiction, and especially in their exaggeration of female sex characteristics. So it was a very strange experience to go from the beauty of the exterior of the temple and the, you know, what was left of the interior to what was actually found on site, that in relation to what went on there at the temple in that shallow drawer in the museum. And yet there were hundreds and maybe even thousands of these votive figures in there. You know, I think of that whenever I am forced to confront the pornifying quality of our communication today, our advertising, our marketing, our clickbait, you know, all of the things that we see online, the billboards that I pass on the highway that routinely objectify women and demean them. all the while we're making all these statements about how we're going to believe women and listen to women and hear them, when they say me too. I think there's this break between our ideals and our daily life, and it's a real rupture. And I think it's because those ideals are no longer sustainable for us, given our religious culture, given our distancing from the God who made those ideals possible, who revealed morality to us in its most fundamental way.
Yeah. I think another one that came across whenever I read your book was abortion and infanticide, and how Christians were left to pick up children and so on in the ancient world. Can you tell us a bit about that and how we developed this understanding of the dignity of the unborn and young children and everything?
Yes. Well, I mean, most people don't know today that abortion was very common in the ancient world. Most people think it's a modern innovation. Most people think contraception is a modern phenomenon, but these are not. I mean, there's plenty of evidence that contraception was practiced widely in the pagan world. There's also plenty of evidence that abortion was fairly routine in the pagan world, the Greco-Roman world. We have descriptions from the Hippocratic corpus about how to perform abortions, and from later physicians as well. And they also prescribe the herbs that will cause a spontaneous abortion, or not a spontaneous abortion, but will cause miscarriage in women. So we have plenty of evidence of this from antiquity. And the Christian authors certainly condemned this with one voice. The other phenomenon that was very common in that world, and in all ancient civilizations, apart from Judaism, was infanticide. If you did not want the baby that was born, you killed the baby that was born. And the most common ways of doing this were either drowning the baby in a bucket of water immediately upon birth, or leaving the baby out at the edge of town by the dung heaps, so that the predators could go and feed on it. Or, you always had in the back of your mind the founding myth of Rome, that Romulus and Remus, the founders of the city, were rescued by a she-wolf who suckled them, right? So you could almost feel good about it, that you were leaving them out there. And if the gods wanted to smile on that child, they would send a sympathetic she-wolf, right? Well, what happened in the ancient world is that because of contraception, because of abortion, and because of just the sexual practices in general, marriages were pretty unhappy, and very few marriages, produce children at a certain point, and this becomes a crisis. The couples were often estranged from one another after they produced their one son as an heir, but many couples began to just decide not to have children at all, and this becomes a crisis even as the 1st century BC turns to the 1st century AD. And we find the Emperor Caesar Augustus talking about this as a crisis in the empire, and especially in the city of Rome. He's saying that this is going to be the downfall of our culture. It's going to mean social instability. It's going to mean that there will be nobody to man our armies in the coming generations. It's going to mean that we'll be dependent on all of these foreign peoples, these conquered peoples, to run our institutions. And do you really want that? And everybody, of course, said, no, we don't want that. But they didn't want to have children either. So we have these great figures like we have Cicero and Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, all speaking about the joys of childlessness and describing a situation where more and more couples were deciding not to have children at all, and kind of living their leisured lives from one wine-fueled hookup to the next, and being on permanent vacation. The satirists even describe the the ubiquity of abortion and of contraception, and decrying this situation. It's there in the works of Juvenal as well. So yes, I think that it was a crisis, because all of these practices, which were condemned by Christianity from the very beginning, were typical practices in the culture. I have to say, though, that these are practices that are condemned in the Old Testament for the most part, and which the Jews were condemning at this time. But the Jews were a localized people, and they were a tiny minority. Christianity posed a threat because it was preaching the same morality, but it was extending it to the entire world, and even obliging the entire world to follow it. The paper trail is very clear, especially in the condemnation of abortion, contraception, and infanticide. From the earliest documents we have, these practices are condemned by individual Christians and by the Christian church. And that teaching is consistent throughout the first millennium of the church.
Thank you for that, Mike. And I think regarding discontinuity, then maybe that it's even worse in some ways now. Well, obviously because of the technological developments. I think also because, as you mentioned, the Christians then did have the opportunity to save young infants and different things, whereas now it seems to be that the government rigs the services so that Christians are persecuted so that they can't even adopt if they refuse to celebrate certain transgender shibboleths or things about homosexuality and things like that. And also, would it be fair to say that it's worse in another sense that Ivan Illich talks about the corruption of Christianity and how the best things are perverted to the worst, so that universal emphasis on mission and spreading the gospel around the world has been kind of appropriated by the dominant secularist culture. Now they want to spread the abortions in whatever it is to Africa and Asia and all those places. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. I think that there's something more fundamental that divides us, or divides the modern pagans from ancient pagans, and that is that the ancient pagans still had a religious sense. They still had a longing for transcendence in some form that the Christians could appeal to. They could say, look at this in your religion. Look at the way you offer sacrifice. Look at the reverence you have for your temples and for your gods. And they could use that as an opening for a conversation about religion in general, and then about Christianity in particular. We don't have that today. There is such an emphasis on immanence and such an allergy to transcendence that it's hard to get to that place. In the ancient world, I think you could always appeal to certain basic foundations that we just don't have in the modern world, and they provoke an eye roll when you bring them up. So that is the more fundamental thing, I think, that divides us.
And then with that in mind, what are one of the two elements then that we can focus on to re-evangelize the world? I guess building on what the fathers and mothers of the church did, and also adding our own emphasis in that new challenge, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll send up a warning flare first, and that is that I'm entirely Sicilian by my heritage. Okay, all four of my grandparents emigrated from Sicily, so as a Sicilian, I'm by nature anti-clerical. So I think that we have inherited a clerical culture that's fairly toxic, and that almost encourages a laziness in the laity. Okay, if you look at the early history of Christianity, what you find is that evangelization was carried forward mostly by lay people. The clergy were very few in number because it was a very risky thing to be a cleric. You were essentially a public member of the church, and when the practice of Christianity is itself illegal, this is a very dangerous thing. So the clergy were few in number, and they had no access to mass media, to the public. And what were the mass media at that time anyway? there was no printing press, there was no radio, certainly no internet or anything like that. You had to be able to speak in the public square, or you had to have the freedom to talk to your neighbors. It was lay people who did that. Lay people who carried the gospel into the world, and by their lives, by their example, by their friendship, converted the people next door. They had to be open to it, and they had to be alive to the possibility, and they had to be eager to do it. You know, at the same time, they had to be prudent. They had to be careful. They had to be mindful of the sensitivities of others and of the good of the family. You know, you didn't want to expose your family to undue risk of martyrdom. But at the same time, you wanted to convert the people next door. It wasn't so much a desire, a strong desire to change the government. That happened in time. But the desire in their hearts was to convert the people next door, the people who they dealt with every day in the market, the people who bought their vegetables when they had their stand there in the forum. This was their idea, and we've got to recover that sense. All of this mourning and lament about the loss of Catholic institutions. Listen, I have some sympathy for that. You know, I grew up with the benefit of those institutions, and I've already paid some tribute today to what I gained from them, and I'm grateful for that. But we've got to start thinking like the first Christians. We've got to start thinking like the Christians of the first 3 centuries, because even though the law was against them, even though Christianity was a capital crime, even though they had no mass media like EWTN or Catholic news service or anything like that, they succeeded in converting their world, and eventually they succeeded in converting their government. How did they do this? The sociologist Rodney Stark, you know, immersed himself in the evidence from those centuries, and he came to the conclusion that the church grew during that 275-year period at a steady rate of 40% per decade worldwide. 40% per decade worldwide. Now, my parish has not seen 40% growth per decade ever. Okay, maybe since year 0 to year 10. but I mean, that's it. That's it. 40% per decade, the church was growing, not through programs, not through institutional charities, not through superism or anything like that. The church was growing through love, through friendship, through one heart setting another heart on fire, through Christian conversation. This is what we have to recover in our time, so that we convert hearts the same way. It's not going to work any other way. It's not going to work by our buying out the media in order to make it more sympathetic. As you pointed out earlier, often that corrupts and it becomes political and it becomes something wicked.
Yeah, marvelous. Thank you for that, Mike. And I should say that you've written about this extensively. The fathers of the church, you offer an introduction to the first Christian teachers, and the mothers of the church, you call the witness of the early Christian women. And what were some of the things, building on what you've said there, that they did? Can you tell us about the canon, the forms of worship, creed, and things like that?
Well, you know, all of the things that we find distinctive about Christianity, you mentioned the canon. If we can talk about the Bible today, it's because there's a canon of the New Testament and a canon of the Old Testament, and we collect them all together in one book. Now, they were not collected all together in one book until the end of the 4th century, the beginning of the 5th century. And in the centuries leading up to that, there was a lot of discussion that went on about what should be in that list and what should not be in that list. And it all came down to kind of a discovery of the books that had been used publicly in the worship of the church, in the liturgy. Mm-hmm. And so that's how we got the canon that we have today. But other things, of course, did find their canonical form during that time. The great liturgical families, the Latin rite and the Byzantine rite, and the other rites of the church, the the Chaldean Rite, all of these beautiful liturgies that are still in use today were in use in the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century when they found their canonical form. The creeds you mentioned, which began earlier as short statements of faith, but eventually were elaborated to include what we would consider the core doctrines related to the Trinity and the Incarnation, the Christian distinctives, the things that we have to hold on to in order to call ourselves Christian. So much of what identifies us as Christian today, especially in the what we would call the historic churches of the Catholics and the Orthodox and the Anglicans who want to take hold of that tradition, was established in the 4th century, and it's really wonderful that there's been a retrieval in our time of the memory of those times. In the 19th and 20th centuries, we've begun this historical retrieval of the evidences of the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, immersing ourselves in them and trying to figure out how they might be relevant to our lives today. This has been going on, of course, since the Oxford movement, at least, actually a little bit older than that in the Anglophone world. But it's a wonderful thing. And it's similar to what was going on actually in the 4th century when Christianity was finally above ground, was finally legal. And at that time, there was a great gathering in of all the documents that had been composed and compiled in the centuries before, but kept underground because it was illegal to own Christian documents. So the 4th century was this great ingathering. It was this great moment of patrology, the study of the earlier fathers. And we're living in one of those moments now when we gather together all of these works of our earlier ancestors, our fathers, and we're studying them with greater vigor, and we're learning from them. It's a really exciting time. And I'd say that movement in scholarship and just in general interest, because there are historians doing it, but there are also history buffs who are immersed in it. I don't consider myself an academic historian. I'm a history buff, but we're able to be immersed in that because there's so much going on.
Yeah, marvelous. And then I want to ask you about, I guess, something to do with the historical imagination and going outside of our time. So our modern era is very focused, obviously, on the self and happiness as defined, not as even as the Greeks, the virtue ethicists would describe it as, say, eudaimonia or anything. It's more to do with simple pleasures and even pornography and things like that. You were talking about perverse things earlier on. So what can the fathers and mothers of the church teach Christians about things like holiness, which we don't focus on as much nowadays?
It's really important to be recollected. And that, of course, is a concern of the fathers, and to live in the moment and to try to do the will of God and to be attentive to other people. And that really requires an effort today because so many people live with headphones on. Okay, so they really signal to you that they are not open to a conversation. They are not open to a relationship. They are not even open to an exchange unless it's extremely transactional where they give you money in return for a product or a service. And even then, you'll exchange nods or, a shake of the head. Mm-hmm. We have lost so much in terms of interpersonal relationship. The fathers did not live in a world like that. They lived in families, and the families tended to live in fairly small homes. Even my parents grew up in homes that were only one room, and they slept on the floor of the room where they ate the next day. So we've lost so much in the time because we've withdrawn into our rooms, not only our bedrooms, but this room that we've built around ourselves. So we're not open to family. We're not open to friendship. We're not open to any kind of interpersonal relation. Everything's about me and my pleasure. There's this great longitudinal study that's been conducted since the 1980s about friendship and social isolation. And when it was begun, most people who were involved in the study said they reported that they had at least 3 people in whom they could confide. 3 people they would call friends. The last time the data got its update, the majority of people reported that they did not even have a single person they could confide in, a single person they could call a friend. That should be an unacceptable situation to us. And you know, it's almost amusing. I saw that the British government now has a minister of friendship in order to promote friendship, because we've come to recognize that there are social consequences to this, and there are consequences for health and for the economy and for everything else. But I mean, it's almost comical. It's almost like something out of Monty Python, where you have a minister of friendship, you know, laying down the laws about how to be friends. Yeah. The Christians did not have to be required to make friends, because Jesus had said to them, listen, I'm God, and I call you friends. And that transformed them. If God himself, in spite of this infinite inequality, has condescended to call me a friend, then I'd better not be excluding anyone from my potential friend group. Mm-hmm. So Christians had this expansive idea about friendship, and friendship became the medium for evangelization. It's not that they were instrumentalizing other people. It's not that they were looking at them as, potential statistics for church memberships. No, they were loving these people in imitation of Jesus Christ, who had befriended them. So we've got to, again, repeat that and get out from under the headphones, get out from our self-imposed isolation, get out from these habits that we've acquired that repel friendship, because we're suffering from it today. If there's a famine in our time, it's the famine of social isolation. If there's a pandemic in our time, it's not coronavirus. It's the pandemic of loneliness, which has only been exacerbated by coronavirus. We've got to get out of these habits that we've taken on ourselves and we've spread throughout the world.
Yeah, most important. Thank you for that, Mike. I want to ask you next about, we know of Newman's, Cardinal Newman's notion, I think he's a saint now actually, of the development of doctrine, but I think that's often misinterpreted, and I wonder if you might help us out as someone who is aware of the early church running right through to today. So the church is a body, and we know the bodies grow, and the church has fleshed out some points over the centuries further. And this seems to make many nervous, but where can we, men and women of today, manifest the gospel in new ways that, again, mark both continuity and discontinuity with the early churches? And what are some of the new opportunities for the church to evangelize, I guess?
The idea of development is there from the beginning, and it was established by our Lord himself. You know, he said that he'd come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So he's telling his followers, he's telling the church ever afterward that you're kind of bound to what you've received in the tradition. You can't just dismiss the last generation or the last 10 generations or the last 20 generations. You've got to come to terms with it. You've got to see your faith in continuity with everything that's gone before. Now that was a challenge. And of course you see St. Paul wrestling with this. You see the apostles wrestling with this at the Council of Jerusalem. How are we in continuity with our Old Testament heritage? So you see that all through the New Testament, and you see it all through the time of the fathers, where they held themselves accountable to the Christians of earlier generations, of early centuries, so that in the early councils of the church, what they had to do in order to argue a certain position was to show that it was the constant position of the earlier fathers, the earlier generations of Christians. This was done famously at the Council of Ephesus, where the fathers who were arguing in favor of addressing Mary as Mother of God had to present a catena, That's Latin for chain, but a catena of teachings that reached back through the centuries to show that the title mother of God was traditional and solidly established for centuries in Christian doctrine and practice, but also that this idea had been there since the time of the founding of Christianity, since the time of our Lord. And so they read aloud this catena, this chain that reached back through the centuries. And that was a common practice in that time, in order to put forth something that might be seen as a development. They had to establish its place in the history of doctrine. Gregory of Nyssa is a great example of this, because he was trying to engage the Neoplatonism of his time and extract from it the things that were good. But he had to show how they fit in to the things that he had inherited from the earlier Christian fathers. This is something that we see all the way through the writings of the fathers. Basil the Great even elaborated the idea in his work on tradition, and also in some of his private letters, where he describes how we hold ourselves accountable to earlier generations, but how we grow in our understanding of the doctrine, that our understanding doesn't remain static. We try to deepen it over the course of our lives and over the course of the history of the church.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that, Mike. I think also you mentioned St. Gregory of Nyssa there. Even in his time, he was writing about the evils of slavery, but obviously after that you had chattel slavery in America and different things like that. But it was abolished by Christians, and it was the seed of Christian truth that was kind of manifested, eventually resulted in its abolition in numerous occasions, different places. And I think, is that a good example of that is gospel truth that is there in the seed form that then is fleshed out over time?
That's a beautiful example, because slavery is one of those institutions that tends to endure. And in the only places where the abolition of slavery has succeeded as a movement, it's because it was able to draw upon Christian principles and argue those Christian principles in the public square. You look back at the New Testament, and I think the seed for the abolition of slavery is in St. Paul's little letter to Philemon, right? Which kind of assumes the equality between slave and master. Well, you see that this has an influence in the Roman world and in the Greek world, because once Christians take hold of government, what they do is they try to bring about that equality in different ways. All right, they didn't abolish slavery, but they made it illegal to rape a slave. They made it illegal to physically abuse a slave or to murder a slave. They made certain practices illegal in the sale of a slave. So there was development there in the understanding of the doctrine that had already been out there in St. Paul's letter to this master about his runaway slave. Mm-hmm. Gregory of Nyssa is arguing in the 4th century, based on biblical principle, on New Testament principle, that slavery needs to be abolished now, that this needs to happen. But he's a lone voice in his time. We find Christians, and we find Christendom itself struggling with this idea, at least saying in the Middle Ages that one Christian could not enslave another Christian, which is, again, an advance. The entire feudal system was created in order to make slavery go away and to ensure that everyone had a certain ownership of at least something, of himself. So this was also an advance. It wasn't enough. So we find slavery returning to Europe in its fuller forms, especially in Spain, which was not a Christian country at the time. And unfortunately, it was from Spain that the slave trade really spread throughout the Western world, and was practiced once again, as it had been in pre-Christian times. And this provoked the call for an abolition of slavery that finally succeeded to a pretty remarkable degree in the West, at least. I wouldn't say it's entirely successful yet. We still have forms of slavery that are very much alive in our world. But at least we have a rhetorical advantage now, thanks to Christianity, that slavery should be abolished, that it should not exist in any form.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. I think it also speaks to your point too, that you need the structure of Christian faith or Judeo-Christian faith in order to argue against it in a universal and binding manner, I think. Whereas if you, I guess, accept certain presuppositions that are like life is about materialism and you're the product of randomness plus time and so on, or you maybe a Marxist dialectic or different things that you can argue under the premises that they have built into them for subjugating different groups, whether a different class or anything, because they haven't got the right class consciousness, or I guess now the new form of Marxism, they have it with race consciousness and different things. And you can see even in the Muslim world today that there's still slavery and things like that in certain forms. And I think it speaks to the uniqueness of the Judeo-Christian understanding of the dignity, in line with what you said about the dignity of human persons and everything, that this is abhorrent, and not only at a personal level, but this should be the way societally, and there's actually a universal standard that we can all bind ourselves to, and it actually makes sense in line with God's revelation, rather than just a product of, say, one human mind, or this is what I would like and I want to force my sentiments on the rest of society or something. Does that make sense? I'm reading a book about this kind of thing, about the modern self by Carl Trueman, who I'll be interviewing soon. And it's interesting to see how even Rousseau and different people in history who weren't Orthodox Christians would reason about the nature of persons, the nature of society and things like that. And you can see, according to their own premises, that they don't have a logical argument for universal human dignity or something like that, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes. And it does, I think we've all got to call ourselves account for this, because we all tolerate it to a certain extent. Here in America, we like to shop in these stores where the prices are very low, and they have the sweaters I want at a price that I'm willing to pay, and we kind of know that the reason the prices are so low is because they're made by slaves. The goods are made by slaves, and yet we buy them anyway because we want to save money for our retirement rather than spending the money, for people to make our clothes now. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think we have to hold ourselves to a high standard, to think about the consequences of our decisions, our purchase decisions, and other things, that right now we might be doing in a mindless way, or just because they bring pleasure or a certain advantage, a material advantage to us. It's a time for Christians to desire a certain degree of heroism that maybe we're not desiring right now. We might be called to give up certain things that we've come to like an awful lot, if not love, because the things that we like are making possible practices that we abhor.
Yeah, marvelous. Well said, Mike. Thank you for that. I think too that something that comes across in your work is the revolutionary change in the relationship between men and women. I want to ask you then, how does the both and of the Christian life, so elevating men and women together, differ from more antagonistic visions? So I think of, say, modern feminism, which seems to pit men and women against each other, and even aggressive visions of the male as the dominant figure from other traditional societies and so forth.
I think it's very easy for us to, as men and women, to fall into an antagonistic way of dealing with one another, okay? Because we are so so different from one another. We can choose to see ourselves as complementary, but often what we're confronted by is this antagonism, where we disagree, where we don't see things the same way, and we don't really want to make the effort to see things the way the other sees them. So I think that that history is full of witnesses to the antagonism that's there. And I think that the voices of women were silenced for so many centuries because that was the way of establishing the male voice as the representative of truth, abiding truth. You'll recognize, if you go through the literature of antiquity, that there are almost no female voices. We make a big deal out of the poet Sappho because she's almost the only one. Mm-hmm. She's almost the only one out there. Once you see the rise of Christianity, suddenly you see women emerging as teachers, and they're welcomed. The Christians are imprisoned in Carthage during the persecution, and who emerges as their leader, as their teacher, as their guide? It's Perpetua, and she keeps her prison diary, which becomes an immediate bestseller among Christians worldwide, copied out by hand and distributed throughout the world. Perpetua becomes this figure, this riveting figure for Christians, this unmistakably female voice who talks about feminine experience of giving birth, of breastfeeding, and these things that a man cannot experience, a biological male cannot experience, but Perpetua can and does. And she speaks in this unmistakably female voice, feminine voice. This becomes possible with Christianity. Think about the major figures who are still cited today in the Eucharistic prayer, the Roman canon. There's Perpetua and Felicity, Agnes, Cecilia, Anastasia, all of these women's names. If you compare that to what was before, you're seeing two different worlds. In the Greco-Roman world, women were perhaps ornaments in the narratives of the epics, but the heroes of the epics were those males who were most violent, who were most domineering. They were the males who took their weapons and eviscerated their enemies. And in order for us to know them deeply, we had to have a detailed description of that evisceration. We had to see the viscera for ourselves. I'm just going through another reading of the Iliad now, and the intestines are constantly being spilled upon the ground by the heroes, by the men who are considered most virtuous, right? This is the proof of their virtue. Well, what's the proof of Christian virtue? Who are the heroes of the Christian epics? Perpetua, Felicity, Cecilia, Agnes. Agnes becomes a pivotal figure in the history of opinion. She becomes the figure who kind of galvanizes sympathy for the Christian people. This is a remarkable thing, that not only a Christian, but a woman, and not only a Christian woman, but a Christian child, really, she's an adolescent, is able to exercise this kind of influence. The woman's voice begins to come to the fore. Why? Because here's this radical voice of St. Paul telling husbands, he's not telling them, listen, get your wives in line, which is really one of the subtexts of Homer, to kind of control these women. Okay. No, St. Paul is saying, husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. Wow, that's amazing. And saying that in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, woman nor man. And these are all radical propositions. There's neither Jew nor Greek. Wait, I'm a Greek. My people are the people, and you people are barbarians. I'm a Jew. I am one of the chosen people, and you are the goyim, right? But woman nor man, that's the fundamental one. because women were not allowed to be the heroes of the epics. They were not to be allowed to be the teachers in the public square. They were not allowed to be the writers who are read. Even later on in antiquity, when we have female voices among the philosophers, they're there in the academy because of the Christian Revolution, because the Christian Revolution had kind of opened up this respect for women in the figures of its saints. Christianity really did effect a revolution that was so successful, we can't even imagine what preceded it anymore. I can't even imagine a time when my wife or my daughter wouldn't have at least a good shot at being heard in the public square. Now, what I worry about in our slide back to paganism is that women are tolerated in the public square. They're allowed to be voices, but as long as they're pretty, as long as they're telegenic, as long as they're photogenic, as long as they're young, and as long as they toe a certain line that's approved by the media moguls. Once they stray from those things, once they age out, they're no longer listened to. Listen to any Hollywood actress talk about turning 55, and this is what they'll tell you. So I worry that with the slide back into paganism, that the opportunities may be diminishing for my 5 daughters, because this is a big concern of mine. But anyway, I guess that's to be seen.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think too, unfortunately, something that comes across, so in Truman's book that I mentioned before, and also Dr. Scott Yenor, they talk about how women now are, the vision that they are presented of freedom and so on is to become like the male, but like the more base male, given into their lower instincts so that they become more sexually aggressive and things like that. And this is presented as emancipatory, but the Christian vision seems to offer so much more, in line with what you're saying, in both those ways. And in marriage, something you've written about as well, in marriage, that we each have our place. We're different but complementary, and it's centered around God himself, and that makes us holy and so forth, rather than this notion that you should be just like as crude as men can be, and that's your good life, if that makes sense.
And the other thing that Christianity provides is a sense of embodiment, that we are body and soul, that we're these integral persons, right? The idea of personhood involving both the body and the soul is a Christian idea. And so we kind of celebrate our differences in both body and soul. And it seems to me that once you kind of break away from the Christian view of the person, you start to reduce male and female to stereotypes, and you reduce male and female to these caricatures, so that our transgender heroes do not appear to be real life representatives of these genders, but almost burlesques, almost caricatures, parodies of the worst qualities of the worst representatives of male or female. It's a crazy thing that's happening right now in our public.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Mike. I think that ties us in nicely with the next thing I'd love to speak with you about, which is the Mass. So I would regard a lot of these things about our superheroes, or the heroes and heroines we look up to, as kind of idolatry. And we have ritual patterns which form us to worship them and consider them as the most worthy things in society, or most worthy persons in society. Whereas I think you showed that the Mass and the liturgy has formed us for different purposes, and you've written beautifully about that. So you've written Work, Play, Love, How the Mass Changed the Life of the First Christians and the Mass of the Early Christians in different books. So you show that this was the reality most essential to the life of believers, and it deeply affected everything that they did. Can you give us an overview of why this is the case, and what did the Mass look like to the early Christians?
Well, it's the one thing that everybody shared. You know, it was the one thing that was common to everybody's experience, that they went to Mass on Sunday. That's what Christians did. We see that that St. John, for example, composed the book of Revelation. You know, he had the visions. He said when he was worshiping in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. And this is what Christians did. They worshiped in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. So that was the thing that was common to them. The scriptures were not common to the experience of Christians apart from the liturgy, because very few people could read, and even fewer people could afford ever to own a book, because it was something phenomenally expensive. A very wealthy family might own 6 books and consider themselves, you know, fortunate for that. But most people could not own books. Most people could not read books. What they had was the Mass, and the Mass mediated the revelation of the scriptures, because the scriptures were read at every gathering of the Mass. So the scriptures formed community. The scriptures formed the mind. The liturgy formed community. The liturgy formed the mind. The liturgy formed the imagination. We look at the spaces where the early Christians worshiped, and we see that the walls were decorated richly with biblical scenes, with scenes from the lives of the martyrs, and so on. So the imagination of believers was formed by the artwork that they saw when they went to Mass. And even the vessels that were used in the Mass were often richly decorated. Tertullian's writing in the 100s, and he writes of a chalice that has images from the life of Christ on all the sides, you know. So this was something that was common. The Christians gathered together on a Sunday to be formed as Christians, and formed in a very real way by receiving the flesh of Christ, which then, you know, which was then mingled with their own flesh. The blood of Christ then was mingled with their own blood, and they became Christ through the sacrament. This is the fundamental reality in the early church. And as I point out in that little book, Work, Play, Love, it affected the way people worked. It affected the way people played in their leisure, and it affected the way people loved. So what do I mean by that? Well, how it affected the way they worked. Why is that? Well, when they went to liturgy, they often brought their gifts to the altar. Someone baked the bread that was offered. Someone made the wine that was offered. They brought that to the altar. And often laid at the foot of the altar by the early Christians were the other fruits of their labors. The oil that was pressed from olives, the olives themselves, baskets of figs that could be distributed to the poor, all kinds of foods. What we say in the liturgy is that this is fruit of the earth and the work of human hands. We bring it to the altar with the bread and wine. That's what the early Christians did. And so they saw a direct connection between the offering of the fruits of the earth in the Mass and the offering of the fruits of the earth in their everyday work. They weren't just working for a living. They weren't just working for a paycheck. They weren't just working for the weekend. They were working for God, and they were doing it in every moment. If we read, if we read the literature of the Greeks and the Egyptians and the Persians, we see a certain disdain for manual labor, for the work of craftsmen and carpenters and people who were bricklayers, stonemasons. All of these people, their work was looked down upon. That was considered the work of slaves. Aristotle argued that such people should not be citizens. They should not have a share in democracy. And he wasn't the only one to do this. You're going to find the same thing in Herodotus. You're going to find it as late as Plotinus. The idea of working with your hands was disdained. But Christians celebrated labor, and they were even mocked for this. The first anti-Christian book The work of Celsus, written in the 100s, mocked the Christians because who were these people? They were seamstresses. They were nobodies. They were women, for heaven's sake. And he made fun of Christians for accepting people he considered lower class because they worked with their hands. Christians had no part of that. They looked at working with your hands as holy because Jesus himself did that. He was a carpenter, the son of a carpenter, and he made that holy. Paul was a tent maker. All the Christian heroes were manual laborers. They weren't intellectuals. They weren't aristocrats who occupied the priesthoods by virtue of their birth. No, they were people who labored. So their work was holy. So I talked about work. I talked about play and leisure, and how so many of the leisured arts, the musical arts, were renewed because of their association with Christian worship. The painterly arts were renewed because of their association with Christian worship. And poetry that was composed to be sung and recited in the Christian liturgy became something beautiful and began to set trends in the larger world. All of the arts were enriched just by contact with the Christian liturgy. And finally, I talk about love, charity, the love of charity, the love of one person for another. We've already talked about marital love, which was infinitely enriched by the equality of the sexes that was there in Christianity. And we could talk forever about that and how it was evident to the pagans, because Christian husbands genuinely tried to love their wives and tended to stay married and tended to have children. And then the couple tried to love their children, even when it was difficult to do. And their neighbors saw this, and that was one reason for conversion. But there's a larger kind of love. In the ancient world, we hear no talk about charity, which is self-giving love, the kind of love that causes you to sacrifice for the sake of another, especially the sake of a stranger or a foreigner. But that's the kind of sacrifice and the kind of love that Jesus talked about. He tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. Here's this foreigner who's lying in a ditch who really didn't merit the care of the people who walked by. But the good man is the one who tended to him. He was the one who was neighbor, to the man in the ditch, right? So we find this universal concern. We find this universal charity among the Christians of the early centuries, so that no longer are we talking about philanthropy as the pagans did. Now we're talking about charity. That's the Christian term. Philanthropy might raise the Colosseum, which is a remarkable structure, but you'll find the donors, the names of the donors for the Colosseum, in large letters engraved in the side of the Colosseum. You'll find the names of the donors engraved in the side of the Pantheon in Rome. But you don't find that in so many of the early Christian churches, because this was done out of charity. Christians begin to establish institutions of charity. Very early on, during the plagues of the 3rd century, they established hospitals. And later they established schools that were open to everyone and run out of the monasteries. We have infirmaries and hospices and orphanages. All of these things that have become dear to us as a society were established by Christians because of the idea of love, because of the idea of charity, love that was extended to everyone in an indiscriminate way. So I think that work and play and love were the things that made a new culture, a new civilization, and they were established there through the liturgy. They were established by our Lord himself in establishing the liturgy. He knew what he was doing, and he knew the way that this would disseminate this key idea in his church forever, down through the centuries.
Yep, beautiful. I think James K. Smith has written some wonderful stuff that complements your works and showed that we are liturgical beings rather than this notion that he critiques from Descartes and people like that sees us as, what does he call it, brains on sticks and things like this. So we have to live out
exactly. We're
embodied existence. And you go into the details of the Mass in different books, the Mass, the Glory, the Mystery, the Tradition. I want to ask you then, for us today, in line with former generations, why is it important that we become attentive to the details of the liturgy and this embodied story? I guess also in contrast with what we were speaking about earlier, this other dominant stories that tell you you're valuable if you are beautiful or you performed according to the culture or whatever. Why is it important to be reintegrated into the Mass and know the details of the story, if that makes sense?
Because we are liturgical people. Smith is right. We're wired for this, and this is the way our ancestors were formed in the first generations of Christianity. And we're still made to be formed that way. Even if we've checked out of going to church, we're still made to be formed that way, and something else will take over that function in our lives. So I think that some people developed an appreciation of this when during the lockdowns, when they couldn't get to Mass. Mm-hmm. So they were deprived of this, and they felt like something was missing. So they started tuning in online for live streams or for the recorded Mass and that sort of thing, so that they could check in that way. I think that we're made to worship with all our senses, and the Mass gives us an opportunity to do that with our eyes, with our ears, with our hands, with our sense of taste, and with the sense of smell. If you're waving the censer around like my daughter does when she serves Mass, right? All of these things are meant to engage us and to elevate our whole person to God. I think that some people, when they felt that was missing and they checked in online, or maybe when they were just feeling a little desperate and lonely and they checked in online, they rediscovered something about the liturgy. A good friend of mine is a Byzantine priest, and he was one of the early adopters for live streaming liturgy. And so he made his liturgy widely available on the web. And he said that when the churches were reopened and he was back there, it was very interesting, he said, because there was a different congregation in front of him, different faces. These were different people sitting in the pews because they had encountered the liturgy afresh online, watching the video, and they were moved to come back to the pews. I hope a lot of other people are, so they can re-engage that way. When a lot of people say they don't get the sense of community by going to Mass on Sunday. They just feel lost and anonymous, and it just doesn't feel like their ordinary experience of an interactive community. And lots of people say, well, then put more into it and so on. What I always recommend is try to go to Mass a couple times a week then. In addition to your Sunday attendance, go a couple times on weekdays. It's a different experience of the Mass. You'll have different encounters. The makeup of the congregation tends to be different. They're different people. They're there people who are there because they work nearby rather than live nearby. They're people who are there because they really, really want to be there, and not because they have maybe some residual sense of obligation that they have to go on Sunday. To go on a weekday, they have to want to be there. So you're meeting a different kind of people. You're with a different kind of people. They're happy to see you there because they want to see more numbers there. So I think that it can be a very different experience of the Mass if you go a couple times a week for the course of a month or a couple of months. You come out of it with a different feeling for the Mass, and it changes the way you worship on Sunday. Once you've been going to a couple weekday Masses.
Yeah, I can certainly vouch for that too, Mike. So I used to work in Westminster in a school just next to the cathedral, and go in there at lunchtime during the weeks, and it definitely got a different impression of the Mass and different feel and everything. So I'd recommend that to people too, actually. So I want to ask you next about the misconceptions. You've sort of touched upon it there. What are some of the main misconceptions that people have about the Mass, whether that's secularist people or whether that's people within the church even?
When I've brought non-Catholics non-Catholic Christians to their first Mass, the thing that seems to strike them and surprise them is how deeply biblical it is, right? Not only do these Catholics have multiple biblical readings in the course of the Mass, a reading from the Old Testament, a psalm, a reading from the New Testament epistles, and then the gospel. But all of the other prayers of the Mass are largely drawn from the scriptures, and they recognize the echoes. They recognize, the familiar passages from scripture that we take for granted, that we're just repeating, and we don't even think of as biblical texts anymore. Lamb of God who take away the sins of the world. Well, that's from the Bible. So I think that they're often surprised at just how biblical it is, because they've been trained to believe, or conditioned to believe, or misled to believe that that the Mass is unbiblical or even anti-biblical. So that's a common misconception. What I've heard most commonly afterward is that there's more scripture in the Catholic Mass than there is in any Protestant Sunday worship, because of our we're required to read so much of the Bible, both Testaments, every time we gather. And we're required to recite all these biblical prayers, whereas the services in other places might be mostly made up of a sermon that's drawing from not only occasional scripture verses, but also popular culture and whatever happens to enter the mind of the preacher. So that's pretty common. I think the thing that secular people are often surprised by, or just the things that they'd be surprised by in any kind of Christian worship. One, I think they have this impression that we're always hearing promises of heaven or threats of hell. And frankly, I don't hear a lot of either. What I hear is an exhortation to what I think just about anyone would recognize as good, strong, ethical behavior. It's given a Christian foundation, of course, and a Christian expression, but it's something that they'll recognize as a good thing. They're often surprised, though, by the that they don't encounter the stereotypes they've held, which is people who are living for pie in the sky when they die, or people who are living because they're in terror that this whimsical God will consign them to hell if they don't behave, And these things are just not elements of our consciousness. I, in particular, have always been most challenged by eschatology, because I have a congenital inability to think about the future. It's hard for me to think about tomorrow, never mind next week, and certainly not heaven or hell. I know we're supposed to think on these things and meditate on these things, and I do, especially when I make my annual retreat, and these things are before me, but it's just not in my makeup to dwell on the things that are in the future, that may be far off, may be tomorrow, but there's no way of my knowing. So yeah, I think that those things may surprise secularists who come in, that we're not fixated on heaven or hell, or on even on the points of morality that they might think that we obsess on. We don't, but when we're portrayed in the media, we're portrayed as obsessives, because these are the things precisely that the media happen to be obsessing on.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think there's an element of projection there too whenever it comes to Hollywood people, and then it comes out about Harvey Weinstein and different people. These are the people that you're involved with, but these are not the people you come across in church most of the time, despite the stereotypes against Catholics too, I guess. And I think that speaks to Father Schmemann had a book for the Life of the World, and wrote beautifully about the liturgy. I think that was one of Father Merton's favorite books too. And I think that speaks to what you're saying, that it is for the life of the world. It's not about some disembodied hell or heaven that we're ultimately about, but the liturgy is God amongst us in our midst and so on. And that was one of the things whenever I reverted to my Christian faith too, that I appreciated, and I guess probably had those misconceptions too, and too many people do. So I'm glad that your work helps to address those and bring us back to our center and involve us in this theodrama. So I think as well, you've documented that in regards to feasts. So let's speak about that. So the feasts, how the church here forms us as Catholics. So we have that in the liturgy. You also examine the history and the traditions behind some of our favorite and forgotten holidays. What then is at the heart of the message to be found in the passing of days, the weeks, and the seasons in the church?
There's a great saying from the rabbis. It's for the Jew, the calendar is our catechism. It's through the calendar that you remember the marvels the Lord has done. Okay, because you're celebrating certain feasts. The Jews celebrate Passover. Well, we're celebrating certain events that took place in our history. We celebrate Pentecost, and we're celebrating several, historical events that took place in our past. Well, this is what the feasts do for us. They enable us to constantly rehearse the life of Christ, to keep it before us on an annual basis, so that we're following in his footsteps. We're moving from his conception to his birth. We're moving from his birth to his baptism. We're moving from his baptism through his ministry to his passion and death, his resurrection, and then his glorification, and then his sending of the Spirit onto the church. So, we're constantly reliving the mysteries in very vivid ways. We mentioned in the book, the custom that the Jews had in antiquity of teaching children to read by leading them through the Torah. And the first time the child was given the opportunity to recite from the Torah, he was a spoonful of honey was placed in his mouth, so that the memory of the words would always be sweet to him, right? Well, that's what the feasts do. They're filled with all of these traditional goodies, right? These cookies that we bake only at Christmas time, and these foods that we eat only at Easter. And frankly, even the foods we eat only during Lent. The Lenten fish fries in my diocese are a major force in the economy during that time of year, right? So we love these things, and they keep us mindful of the season, which keeps us mindful of the mysteries of Christ, because that's what we're in the midst of as we're celebrating the liturgy during that time. Yeah, the catechism remains our calendar even today, because in it, we're celebrating the past, the marvels the Lord has done, and those he's bringing to fruition. We're also rehearsing the doctrines. We celebrate Corpus Christi so that we remind ourselves of the dogma of transubstantiation. We celebrate Trinity Sunday so that we don't lose touch with the truth that our ancestors were willing to die for, the truth about the Trinity. So all of these things are kept always before us by the calendar. And that's a beautiful thing that we have as Catholics. It's something that's very vivid and that we love. We love it so much that we can't quite forget it. And there have been all kinds of efforts to eradicate the Christian holidays and giving them a new identity, and they've all failed. In the town where I live, in the city nearby, they stopped referring to Christmas as Christmas, and they even stopped referring to December as Christmas shopping season. And at a certain point, they started referring to it as sparkle season. Sparkle season. And all of the people just said, ew, that's just gross. I'm not going to go there. We have this collective memory of the holidays, and it requires a certain religious weight. Apart from that, it just becomes stupid, or worse than stupid, it becomes depressing. The day after Christmas is the day when so many people suffer the most profound depression, because they were not celebrating the birth of Christ. They were celebrating reaching the bottom of the bottle, So in the morning they have a hangover and they don't have Jesus. Some of us, we may have the hangover, but we have Jesus too.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think too that something that I've experienced even in teaching, unfortunately, unfortunately, is that people do, again, we're ritual creatures and we have to have a calendar to orient us in the world. So then you get these invented secularist calendars. You obviously had this with, in an obvious way, with things like the French Revolution, but I think even now with a lot of the neo-Marxism and so on, that our political identities, our sexual identities and things like that become our feasts are centered around, say, Pride Month and things like that. So as a teacher, we're like meant to teach all of these new months and new days that are set, and it's forming these young minds and young hearts and everything else into this secularist calendar. And there isn't that joy, kind of in line with what you say. Those they're not real feasts, they're not real identities, they're not real communities. They're only united around political gains and around the state's whim and so forth. Whereas I think part of the joy is that Christ has actually come and offered this bountiful life, and that is brought about in your work and so on. And it makes me grateful to be a Christian and have those wonderful days and the feasts all year round.
Right? That have a certain weight to them, you know, not ephemeral like everything else. And that's why you can have these lasting ideas like human dignity, like human equality, you know, like human rights that rise out of the Christian reality, because it's real, because it's in tune with the divine truth, and it can have solidity. I don't think that that there's a joy that will attach itself to Earth Day. You know, as much as I love the earth, and as much as I love nature, and as much as I love to take walks in the woods, and I'm a dedicated recycler. You know, as much as I want to reduce emissions and all of those other things, you know, I don't think I'm ever going to feel that kind of joy on Earth Day that I feel on Easter. It's just not going to happen.
Yep. Thanks for that, Mike. And I want to just move now to something more personal to you. So you're interested in poetry. You've written about poetry, the invention of zero and accumulation of poems. And your poems represent different angles and approaches to things found in your non-fiction books, like your spiritual seeking, striving amidst the stuff of everyday work and family life and so on. And you've got a nice form to your works and humor. What really draws you to this medium then, and what inspires some of your favorite poems?
I love the music of poetry, and I think that it's something that's integral to us. It's the way we make things memorable. We make them memorizable by causing them to have a certain rhythm and have a rhyme that people will remember. You kind of have a clue as to what's coming because of the rhyme. So this is the way we think. This is the way we pass wisdom down from one generation to another. You know, you want to teach your kids how to avoid poison ivy. You tell them leaves of tree, let them be, right? It rhymes. They're never going to forget it. It's going to be with them forever. And we've done this with our prayers too. Angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love entrusts me here, ever this day be at my side to light and guard, to rule and guide. You know, we put our religious ideas, our most important ideas, to rhythm and to rhyme, to make them memorable and even memorizable. So for me, I mean, my dominant emotion that I want to convey through poems is my love of God and my love for my wife. And these are the two great themes in my poems. And often they come together in the poems I've written. And you know, it gives a way of conveying strong emotion that prose does not. You know, it's just rhetorically, it's a different experience when you hear something that's rhythmic, that rhymes, that presents itself to you in a way that you're going to remember. So yeah, I've always been drawn to these ways of expression in my reading, and I found myself writing them quite by predisposition, I guess. And when I did study writing at Penn State, that's what I studied. I studied poetry. We didn't call the degree a a degree in fine arts then, but that's what it would be called now. I got my BFA, or whatever you want to call it, from Penn State, and I studied with some remarkable poets. John Balaban, who's still producing great work today, and John Haig, another one of my teachers who has since died. But you know, I had good influences and good guidance while I was young.
Oh, wonderful. And why is it so important for Christians to cultivate this poetic imagination and love for language and its rhythms, especially now in this disembodied internet age with limited Twitter characters and this, what Jacques Ellul has called the humiliation of the word? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that that we want to do this because it's something that's human, and to be fully human is to be so close to divine. We're made in God's image, so the things that are distinctively human are approaching the divine, you know, and they've all been elevated in Jesus Christ. So much of the Old Testament and the New Testament is poetry. It was written according to the forms, the expectations of those times. So we want to pass our treasures along to the next generation in poetic form that they'll understand, in musical form that they'll understand, and that will give them delight. This is the spoonful of honey going in the mouth because these words are so beautiful. Remember when you asked me how I got started in this business of words, and I said I looked in that elementary school textbook and it showed me the delight you could take in one consonant rubbing up against another, or one vowel kind of giving way to a consonant. You know, it's a beautiful thing, and poetry gives us this delight, this sensory delight, and it pairs it with ideas, challenging ideas and challenging images. So this is an exciting thing for me, and I think it's something that's exciting to us as humans. It's that way when we hear poems, especially, but also sometimes when we read them on the page, they can be moving that way because in our mind we're kind of feeling the rhythm, and we're sensing what would happen if it were read aloud.
Yeah, wonderful. And what's it been like then to have your work put to music with someone like Dion, and
oh wow,
have great success in the blues charts and so on? Not that you want to encourage any vainglory or anything.
Man, that's kind of a rush. Now, I have to say that I was probably listening to Dion in the womb, okay? Because I had 4 older sisters who were teenagers when my mother conceived me. My mother was 47 when I was born, and my sisters were all teenagers, and they were all listening to Dion, and they would dance to his records, right? And so I was probably listening to him from the moment of my conception or shortly thereafter anyway. And so I grew up listening to Dion. I met him on a pilgrimage in Italy, actually, some years back. And we established a friendship, and we just started talking on the phone regularly and visiting one another. And we were friends for many years when one day he called me and he left a message on my machine. So this is going back a little ways. He left a message on my machine. He said, I read it in the Rolling Stone. I read it in the Rolling Stone. I want to sing that line in a song, and I want you to write that song. So, I mean, I had not been a songwriter. I had not done this, but I saw what he was doing. You know, he's Italian. I'm Italian. He was daring me to write a song. So I wrote a song, and I called him, and I sent it to him, and we ended up writing an album together. And that was Tank Full of Blues, and that was about 10 years ago. And now we're working on our 4th album together. I'm not sure what this one will be called, but he's already laid down the basic tracks for it. So the songs have already been recorded in some basic form, vocals and guitar and a click track right now. But our last album, which is Blues with Friends, included some luminaries like Paul Simon and Van Morrison and Jeff Beck, who were my heroes growing up. This was the music I was listening to growing up. and others from ZZ Top and from the Stray Cats and other groups from the 80s. But they were so important to me. So we did this album with his friends, Dion's friends from down the centuries, and the album reached #1 in the Billboard charts, and it ended the year as the #1 Billboard blues album, for 2020. So that was a great rush. This is not something I've ever intended to do. It's not something I ever planned to do. It's something I kind of fell into because Dion dared me. And it's something I'm still doing today and loving. I'm really loving it.
Oh, thank God for that now. Long may it continue.
Yeah.
So, A History of the Church in 100 Objects. I want to ask you about that book. So in this book, you tell us the Christian story through the examination of different objects and places, some like Michelangelo's Pieta and priceless works of art, others like a union membership pen, which don't hold much monetary value, but through each of them, you offer a really memorable and rewarding look at the history of the church. So whenever Catholics tell their story, they preserve it in memorials and monuments and artifacts and museums. They build basilicas to house tiny relics. Why does this matter, and what moved you to write this book in this particular way then?
Well, Catholicism is the religion of stuff, right? It's the religion of sacraments and material things that stand for spiritual realities, material things that teach about spiritual realities and symbolize them, signify them, and sometimes even bear them to us. So, I in the book I tell the story about one time my wife and I, with our kids, were going to Mass, and on the way there we passed the priest, the parish priest, and we remarked on how full the parking lot was, and he said, "Oh, it's Palm Sunday." He said, "It's one of the 2 times a year they can come to church and get free stuff." Because you get palms on Palm Sunday. He said the other day was Ash Wednesday, when you get ashes. He said, so everybody goes to church, Palm Sunday and Ash Wednesday, because you get free stuff. Well, to me, Catholicism is the religion of free stuff, and in fact, I think of St. Peter's Basilica, which is the grandest and most glorious church on earth. It's there because it's free stuff. It's St. Peter's tomb. It's Michelangelo's sculpture. It's Brunelleschi's dome. It's all of these things, all of this stuff. It's the colonnade outside, and it's all free. It belongs to Catholics worldwide. People say to the church, why doesn't it sell its riches? Why doesn't it sell its real estate? Well, the reason's simple, because it doesn't belong to the Pope. It doesn't belong to the cardinals. It belongs to the whole church. It belongs to the people of God. It's our stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Well, we have so much stuff, and I'm kind of a junkie for archaeology. So I'm intensely interested in ancient coins, in ancient metals, in ancient lamps, and the things that are scratched into the side of these objects and that sort of thing. I've always been fascinated by archaeology. That's probably how I got into the study of the texts of the ancient fathers. The texts from antiquity was because when I was a little kid, I read the story of how Schliemann discovered Troy, and I wanted to be like him. I wanted to be the guy who put his shovel into the earth and turned it up and found a civilization there. Who found gold there, and found temples and all of these things. To me, reading the church fathers and getting into the stuff of Catholicism is experiencing the joy of Schliemann over and over and over again. And you're discovering something so much greater than Troy. You're discovering the truth, the abiding truth that we share with our ancestors in the faith. So, I glory in the stuff. I revel in the stuff. And my kids do too. And so that's why I wrote that book with my daughter, Grace, who's something of a scholar. She's just about to embark on graduate studies. But she was an undergraduate when we wrote that book together. And we used it as an opportunity to read history together, to single out events that exemplified certain periods of history, and then to think of the object that would embody those events and communicate the message of those events to our readers. So it's a fun book. It's kind of like popcorn. We modeled it after the book that was done by the BBC, the guy at the BBC, A History of the World in 100 Objects, right? So we show people material culture. And from that material culture, we extrapolate to tell the story of an event, you know, and from that event, we tell the story of an era or a period or a figure in history.
Yeah, marvelous. And just to avoid any misconceptions again, then what differentiates our love for holy objects and things like that from idolatry, as people might misperceive it to be?
Well, because we don't make an idol of these things. They're valuable to us because they remind us of holy things, and they're valuable as reminders, right? But we don't worship them, right? So when for example, when all of our churches were taken away from us during the lockdown. Essentially, we weren't allowed to get to the stuff of our faith. We weren't allowed to see the chalices or see the beautiful altar or the artwork in our parishes. Well, then we had to turn our homes into churches. That's what we had to do. You know, we could still be Catholic. We could still conduct our worship because we could pray in our homes and pray with our families. So these, we don't make idols of these things. It's possible to make idols of these things, and I suppose perhaps some people do, but I've actually never encountered that. You know, when one of these items is destroyed by some madman or by some religious zealot who thinks he's going to do us a favor by taking a hammer, for example, to the Pietà, as happened in the 1970s. And I remember it vividly. But you know, we grieve in those times, but not the way we'd grieve for the loss of a family member. We grieve the way we would for the loss of a cultural treasure, and for something that had served for us as a reminder of the person who is most dear to us, and that's our Lord Jesus Christ. So yes, I mean, if someone took my favorite picture of my wife and took it from my shelf and ran out of my house and burned it on my front lawn, I would grieve because that was my favorite picture. And I forgot to make a scan of it so I could have it on my hard drive, and now it's gone, you know, but I still have my wife. I still have my memories of my wife. I even have my memories of that picture. So I haven't lost everything. You know, I haven't lost an idol at that point. I've just lost something that was cherished.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Mike. And what then are some of your own favorite objects and stories that you cover in that book?
Oh, okay. Oh boy. You know, there are a lot of quirky ones in there. I'm going to pull the book down for a second just so I can look at the list, because I have a lot of favorites. But I think my favorite of all of them was something from it was a piece of furniture from the home of the sister of Ignatius of Loyola. Now, why that particular item? It was bookshelves, right? Bookshelves in the bedroom where he stayed when he was convalescing in her home, right? So Ignatius of Loyola is wounded in battle. He cannot walk. He's confined to bed. He's in danger of death because of infection. And all he could do is lie there and read, which is okay. He loves to read. Unfortunately, she doesn't have the kind of books he loves to read. He likes to read adventure stories about knights and their ladies. Mm-hmm. He likes to read stories about military conquest. She doesn't have any of that. What does she have? Popular lives of the saints. Mm-hmm. Those are the only things on her bookshelves. And he starts reading these, and he has a conversion of heart because he sees that these saints are living a true adventure and a true conquest even. And he's inspired to change his life and to become the saint we revere today as the founder of the Jesuits. So his bookshelves are very important to me, especially. Why? Because she didn't have classics on those bookshelves. She didn't have epic poems on those bookshelves. She had popular Catholic devotional books. that are written by people like me, right? They were lowbrow books that were written by people like me, authors like me. So Ignatius was reading, books by the Mike Aquilinas of his day, and I might not think much about what my works are or what they can do, but I can look at that bookshelf and I can see what God could do through my works, and it inspires me as I do my work. So that's one thing that I love in this book. Some of the stuff in the modern era was just fun to do, and one of the things is a hole in the wall here in Pittsburgh. Just a hole in the wall I have. And why is a hole in the wall one of the objects? Well, it was the hole that was used by the radio producer who did the first televised masses from this church in Pittsburgh, okay? And he could watch the progress of the mass from his studio through the hole in the wall. That's one thing. I also have the tools of one of the martyrs, the Mexican martyrs who died during the Cristero War, okay? And I have his tools because he considered the work that he did every day as an automobile mechanic to be holy, to be sacred. I have a picture of a medal that was minted by the government in France in honor of Jacques Maritain, because Maritain is one of the most important figures in my life. He was an inspiration to me, but also because he figures in a major way in Western culture, because he helped to found the United Nations after World War II. And he did so much for the recovery of France after the war. There are other things that are here from the modern era that are unusual, because they're not archaeological items, they're satellite dishes, they're fetal models that are used often by pro-lifers who want to make their point and get their message across. They're cassette tapes that were used to spread the message of the Catholic charismatic renewal, or of the conversions of certain Protestant ministers like Scott Hahn when they came into the Catholic Church and they wanted to let the world know. So they did these little audio cassettes, which went viral in the way that cassettes could in that time. So there are all different items. And of course, from antiquity, there are many items like a sarcophagus, a stone that was in the road, or a little amulet that was a symbol of a certain Christian heresy, or a grate in the floor of a Roman basilica, all different things that lead on to the story of a particular event in history, a particular figure in history beyond that, and then the era as well. So it was a fun book to put together, because I kind of revel in archaeology.
Yeah, wonderful. There's almost as many objects as there are your books now. So I want to look at one more book today, just with you. We can't do all 60 plus, unfortunately. So that one is Angels of God, the Bible, the Church, and the Heavenly Hosts. So you make it known that angels are a large part of reality, and as with other large parts of reality, speeding Mack trucks, for example, or looming brick walls, we benefit greatly from their service, and we ignore them at our peril from the introduction of your book. So how do angels differ from the stereotypes that we're used to, just for starters?
Well, we'll read the scriptures, and what you find out from the scriptures is that the angels are ubiquitous in our lives. They're ubiquitous in the church. They're ubiquitous in the cosmos. They're there from the first moment of creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, that's not talking about the sky and the land. That's talking about the spiritual realm and the material realm. And what is the spiritual realm? It's the realm of the angels and archangels, thrones and dominions, cherubim and seraphim, all of these spiritual beings that we refer to colloquially, generically, as angels. And it's not just Christians who believe in these beings who are intermediate between God and man. Even philosophers, modern philosophers like Mortimer Adler, came to a belief in angels before he came to a belief in Christianity. Mm-hmm. He believed that angels were necessary for thinking about the world and how natural processes take place. Isaiah Berlin was someone who came to similar conclusions. So you don't need to have faith in order to posit the existence of angels in the order of the cosmos. But if you do have faith, then you see from the witness of the Old Testament and the New Testament that angels are everywhere. And if you read the book of Revelation, you see that angels are involved in the natural processes. They're also involved in the course of history. They hold back the winds, and the rains, and they open up the floodgates and that sort of thing. But also they guide the course of history, and they guide the way of the church during the course of history. We see this in the book of Daniel as well in the Old Testament, that angels are active in the life of God's chosen people, and that angels are active even in the relations that go on among nations, that there are guardians that are assigned to different nations. So, the problem with the modern age is that we tend to go with certain axioms like what you see is what you get, right? Mm-hmm. And seeing is believing. And you don't see angels because they don't have bodies. They don't have any material component. Sometimes in the scriptures and sometimes in history, they've taken on a certain guise. They've taken on certain material appearances in order to make an impression on human beings. So the Archangel Raphael, for example, wants to walk with Tobias and influence him. So he takes on the appearance of another human. But other angels want to intimidate the prophets like Isaiah and Daniel and Ezekiel. And so they take on these very intimidating forms with many eyes and gigantic size and many wings, and they look menacing. Well, angels take on the form that they need in order to deliver their message. The very word angel, angelos in Greek and malach in Hebrew, the very word means messenger. So they're all about the message. In this case, the medium is the message. Mm-hmm. God creates the angels in order to deliver a message to earth. It's the ordinary way, says Philo of Alexandria, that God inspired the scriptures, inspired the prophets. This is how the word of God reaches human ears, through the mouths of the prophets. It reaches the prophets through the ministry of angels. So we miss so much when we edit them out of the scene. And I think we do this habitually. We tell the story of Abraham without remembering that it's the hand of an angel that keeps him from sacrificing his son Isaac. That's a pivotal moment in human history. We edit angels out of the Exodus, and we forget that it's the voice of an angel that speaks to Moses from the burning bush, and that it's a guardian angel that leads the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt in the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. We forget these things. We edit them out of the scene. We don't want to remember them. What we remember drama as today is human drama, the conflict of one human with another and the resolution of that conflict. And so the angels aren't in the scenes anymore. And if we see them at all in artwork, or if we hear about them at all in our poetry, they're treated almost like ornaments on the picture frame, or as kind of bit players. But they're not. You think about that drama of Abraham and Isaac, and the angel there was not a bit player. He was a major actor in the drama. And angels are major actors in the drama of our lives. And if we ignore them, we're ignoring a big component of our life. We're pretending something that's there is not there. So as you said earlier, we ignore them at our peril, and we contemplate them to our advantage, because they're messengers from heaven. And they're instruments of Almighty God. They're intended as this is mind-blowing, but they're intended as servants to us even though they are our intellectual superiors and even capable of greater physical feats than we are, they're still our servants, because we are the body of Christ on earth, and we receive him sacramentally, and we can suffer the way he suffered. So we have a dignity that not even the angels have, and they recognize that, and they honor it, and they want to act in our lives in a more effective way. Why do we have to acknowledge it? Why can't they just do it? Because heaven will never force our hand. Heaven will never coerce us. The primary principle of heaven is freedom. God makes us in order to be free creatures, and he wants us to use that freedom to respond to his graces, to co-respond to his graces, to accept them, and to love him freely. The angels are all about that freedom. What they want is our free cooperation, which we enable and we empower when we acknowledge their presence. And that's all that Catholic devotion to the angels is. It's an acknowledgement of the presence and the power of God in our lives through the ministry of the angels. So when we say the guardian angel prayer that I recited earlier, all we're doing is giving consent to the holy angels' operation in our lives. We're giving them consent to work with us. We're saying, I want to cooperate with your activity. Billy Graham, the great evangelist, encouraged Christians to have an awareness of the angels. But what the Old Testament and the New Testament teaches us is to go beyond mere awareness and work with them, cooperate with them, talk with them, as Zechariah did in the Old Testament and as Jesus does in the New Testament. Listen to them as Paul did and as John did. Work with them. And that's how we'll operate together. We'll cooperate in the creation of our world, in the running of the cosmos, in the making of history.
Yeah, wonderful. I think too that your work corrects a lot of the assumptions that we have from our materialist paradigm and from Freud and people like that onwards, which tends to psychologize different realities and doesn't recognize the different ontological nature of the ontological nature of, say, these angels and stuff that you're talking about that are invisible, and sees them as projections of our mind. But I think as you show, and as the Bible shows, that the story is a lot more complicated and interesting and everything than that. And it complements what I spoke to Dr. Richard Beck about this. He's a Christian psychologist, and he's written a book about returning to an understanding of the devil, Old Scratch, he called it. And if we don't, somebody pointed out some of the dangers that if we do ignore that reality, even that in the sense that we will make demons and angels of people in the material world. So then our politicians become either just demonic or angels, and it becomes an awful source of idolatry.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And these realities are not coming from within us. I was looking for a book on my shelves. I can't reach it right now, but it's called The Third Man Factor. It's not a book of Christian faith, but what it does is it looks at a certain phenomenon of what happens when someone is in extreme peril and experiences the presence of another person, even maybe sometimes a person who cannot be seen at all, but who is acting in that present moment to liberate them, to help them, to release them from peril. And sometimes that person does superhuman events or enables the human actor to do superhuman things, like lifting a car off a person who's trapped and that sort of thing. So he draws from examples where there's a lot of evidence. For example, moments from the lives of deep sea divers or people who climbed the Himalayas, and they found themselves in moments of dire peril, but moments that were well documented and witnessed by others. And he goes through these things and he puts them out there one after another. And as a Christian reading this book, you're saying, this is all about the intervention of angels. And yet the author never draws that conclusion. Okay, just shows you that there is this phenomenon in the world that we do not understand. And often people like astronauts and aquanauts encounter this phenomenon, and we can't explain it. And I think that the most elegant explanation for it, the simplest explanation for it, is the existence of angelic beings who are indeed guardians and who would have the motivation to act in this way. So again, that's not a book of Christian faith, but it's a book that I think a Christian can understand as something of a demonstration of angelic activity. Yeah, people can psychologize those things all they want, but it's hard to explain these things otherwise. Conversely, it's very hard to explain some of the things that have happened in exorcisms and continue to happen today in exorcisms, apart from a belief in demonic intelligence and angelic intelligence, superhuman intelligence that has gone sour, gone bad, that is in rebellion against God and good.
Yeah. What changes then do you find yourself most drawn towards, and what makes them so captivating for you then, Mike?
What changes?
What angels are you drawn to? Like,
Well, I mean, obviously Saint Michael the Archangel, because I bear his name. Okay, so I've had an intense awareness of him as my patron, my namesake, all my life. My father was also Michael. My oldest son is Michael. So there's been a lot of Michael talk in my days over the course of my life. He's someone we seem to be recovering our devotion to because of the demonstrable rise in the level of demonic activity. You can believe what you like about what happens in an exorcism, but you have to see that there's a greater demand for exorcism right now, and of the phenomena that seem to require exorcism. You know, there seems to be a rise in these phenomena in our own time. So much so that the Vatican asked the US bishops to put out an FAQ on exorcism on their website. And now there's been an increased demand for training for exorcists among the clergy. And I know here in my own diocese, suddenly there's been an increase in this activity. It's been happening, and this is, you know, we could talk forever about what might be happening there. But what I find that's heartening as a result is this increased devotion to Saint Michael the Archangel, because he's a terror to demons. You know, he is shown battling Satan in the epistle of St. Jude in the New Testament. He's battling with Satan and he's victorious. You know, he's shown battling Satan in the book of Revelation and he emerges victorious. You know, so Michael is someone who we find in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. He's in the book of the prophet Daniel, and he's a major figure. He's a major figure in our history. So yeah, he's always been a key patron of the church during times of peril. The church goes to him with an intense devotion during times of persecution. There was a lot of devotion to Saint Michael during the years of Roman persecution. It's good to see it coming back now. I think we need it. There's also been an increased awareness of Saint Raphael and even an increased devotion to him, thanks in part, I think, to the witness of the novelist Flannery O'Connor. In one of her letters, she counsels devotion to Saint Raphael as the angel of happy meeting for people who are trying to find a spouse, for example, because it was the archangel who led Tobias to find his beloved Sarah. So people who are looking for that happy meeting, but also people who are looking for friendship, because the archangel became a dear friend to Tobias, really his best friend and his companion as he walked. So people who are looking for friendship, people who are struggling with loneliness, can go to Tobias as the angel of happy meeting and find him there. I have a devotion to Saint Gabriel because all of my work is communications. Most of it written communications, but increasingly as well, electronic communications. And so those of us who are in this field look to Saint Gabriel and Saint Clare of Assisi as our two patrons, those who help us get the word out. Why Gabriel? Well, because he delivered the most important message in all of history. He delivered the Annunciation to Our Lady, so that she would hear the message of God, about the incarnation of the Son of God and her role in it.
Yep. Beautiful. Thank you for that, Mike. And thank you for a wonderful conversation today. I just want to ask you before we close up then, is there anything else that you're working on at the moment, or that you still feel get the passion to get involved with in the future?
Oh my, there are so many things that I'm working on at the moment. Quite recently, I finished a book on the church fathers and their ideas about friendship. And that should be coming out soon from Emmaus Road Press. I finished another book on St. Joseph that just came out in time for the year of St. Joseph. I did not know that this was coming, but my book actually was in the warehouse the day Pope Francis announced this. So my book, St. Joseph and His World, came out, and it's here. I hope to enhance the experience of many people during this wonderful year. So there's that. I also have a short biography of Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, a great writer from the 100s, and a great teacher in the church, a great figure in church history. And that should be coming out this spring from Our Sunday Visitor Press. So I have a lot of books that are about to come out or are just coming out, and a lot more that I'm just beginning. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the future. I just wrote a poem, just finished it and sent it off, and it was accepted. It should be appearing in St. Austin Review very, very soon. So these are active times, and there's a lot that's brewing.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank God